This is the beginning of part 2 of our module on conduits and SIVs. We remind you that this part 2 contains chapters 3 and 4 of the module, with chapter 3 reviewing structured investment vehicles or SIVs, and chapter 4 offering a brief discussion of why conduits and certain SIVs fared so badly during the credit crisis. This chapter 3 reviews structured investment vehicles or SIVs. SIVs owe their existence to many but not all of the same principles that motivate the use of multiseller conduits, but are different in some critical respects. This chapter will attempt to clarify the key differences. A bank attracted to a high-grade, high-quality investment, such as a AA security, may conclude nonetheless that the tight credit spread of the instrument is insufficient to allow it to meet its minimum hurdle for return on regulatory capital. As a potential solution, the bank might book the instrument in an unconsolidated SPV while continuing to earn all or a portion of the available spread. This might diminish the capital charges required, given the off-balance sheet nature of the booking vehicle, and thereby lift the return on capital above the minimum hurdle rate. We will work our way through the principal features of SIVs, SIVs, by way of an example. Assume first that certain 3-year AA floating rate securities, such as some senior tranches of CDOs or paper issued by financial institutions, yield LIBOR plus 25, and that the SPV purchases 100 of these securities, each in an amount of, let's say, $10 million, thereby reaching an aggregate size of $1 billion. Assume next that the SPV issues $950 million of commercial paper, which would represent 95% of its total liabilities, and a final $50 million, or 5%, in the form of more junior or subordinated notes, typically referred to as the capital notes. The commercial paper, we assume, pays LIBOR flat, while the capital notes, as shown here, receive everything left over, which we write for the time being as LIBOR plus S for spread. We ignore, as before, all other administrative, legal, and other costs for the sake of simplicity. If no defaults occur, we can easily show that the yield on the capital notes would be equal to LIBOR plus 500 basis points, derived by solving for the value of S in the equation that has just appeared, where 100 times L plus 25 represents the aggregate yield on the assets, and that must equal 95 times L, the yield on the CP, plus 5 times L plus S, the yield on the capital notes. Now, since all assets are rated AA and often higher, it really is not inconceivable that the default rate of this portfolio over just 3 years could indeed turn out to be zero, leaving this very attractive return for the capital notes relative to an investment of apparently pretty modest risk. The 500 basis points of spread would presumably be available to be shared between the holders of the capital notes and the sponsor of the SIV, who is normally also acting as asset manager, selecting the assets for purchase, reinvesting proceeds from asset sales and from redemptions in new assets, and so on. The chart on this page shows the dramatic growth experienced by the SIV market in the past decade, with the greatest period of growth occurring during the 3 years immediately preceding the start of the credit crisis in July 2007. This very high growth, as we will see, became a classic winner's curse, since much of the theory behind SIV's ability to repay their senior debt holders stems from their assumed ability to liquidate their assets quickly if that becomes necessary. The description of SIVs we provided so far is easy to understand, we believe, but has omitted a number of issues and complications to which we must now turn. These include, first, some discussion of whether the size of the capital notes is large enough to convince the rating agencies to grant their highest credit rating to the CP. Second, what liquidity mechanisms are available to the SIV, since it is running a huge tenor gap between its assets, which have a maturity, let's say, of 3 years, and its commercial paper liabilities, whose maturity could be around 15 days. And third, what other conditions are imposed by the rating agencies on the SIV in case of deterioration in the portfolio credit quality. To analyze the sufficiency of the subordination provided by the capital notes, we assume first that the portfolio is static, i.e. that it does not change at all once it has been purchased. The 5-year default probability of AA securities is well below 1% and has never come close to reaching 5% at any time in history. Remembering also that securities in default have a recovery value that often exceeds 50% of par, we can see under this analysis that the subordination provided by the capital notes is amply sufficient, based on these assumptions, to absorb any foreseeable losses in the portfolio, and therefore they leave the CP to be repaid in full. As a matter of fact, the rating agencies calculate or determine the minimum size of the capital notes, assuming the arranger is asking for a credit rating on the CP in the highest possible ratings category, via a matrix such as the one you see here from Fitch, which takes into account, as you can see, both the credit rating of the underlying asset as well as its tenor. With some interpolation, we can quickly see that a portfolio consisting entirely of 3-year AA rated securities would have a capital charge falling between 4 and 7%, and if we assume linear interpolation, we would be very close indeed to 5% required capital support in order to achieve this desired maximum credit rating on the CP. Liquidity presents a more complex set of considerations. As with multi-seller vehicles, it is anticipated that the SPV would normally be able to refinance its commercial paper on each maturity date, but once again, this cannot be guaranteed. In this instance, however, the use of bank liquidity for 100% of the portfolio size would erode the economics of the transaction, since the available spread between assets and liabilities is only 25 basis points in aggregate. Liquidity is therefore enhanced typically through a combination of 3 features which are described below. Feature 1, the SPV issues not only commercial paper, but also notes with a longer tenor, generally referred to as medium-term notes, MTNs. This diminishes the extent and frequency of the SPV's refinancing risk, but at the same time erodes some of the available spread, since the MTNs are unlikely to be issued at LIBOR flat given their longer tenor. The chart you see here describes the split in SIV funding between CP and medium-term notes for a number of SIVs rated by Fitch. Note also that one SIV, specifically Sigma, the one on the right, uses the repo market for a small portion of its funding, in essence pledging its assets as collateral for cheap short-term funding from banks usually. This next chart illustrates the weighted average life of the various SIVs mentioned previously with regard to their senior debt instruments, i.e. the CP and the MTNs, and reveals a pronounced concentration of the medium-term note maturities between 1.5 years and around 2.5 years, or a little longer, as mentioned previously. Note that the CP is really very short-term and seems to have an average weighted average life of about 1/4, or about 90 days in this case. Feature 2, the asset manager agrees that if the SIV's liquidity or solvency appear under threat due to any number of specified factors and tests, it will initiate a sale of the assets and apply the proceeds towards the repayment of the senior liabilities that come due and cannot be rolled over, i.e. the CP and MTNs. The triggers for putting the SIV in this liquidation mode vary across different transactions, and sometimes allow the SIV a sort of grace period in which it can take corrective remedies to fix its balance sheet and liquidity and then revert to a normal operating mode. Feature 3, finally, addresses the immediate liquidity needs of the SIV in case of a disruption in its ability to refinance its commercial paper, but before it has started the process of raising cash by liquidating its assets. Under this feature, the SIV is required to obtain backstop liquidity in the form of bank lines, just like the MSVs, but in an amount that usually represents only 20% of its total liabilities, given the availability of the other sources of liquidity we have described above, and in order to keep the total cost of this feature down to a minimum. The diagram here summarizes everything we have talked about so far, including the issuance of both types of senior debt, CP and MTN, and the provision of partial liquidity via backstop lines of credit. Note also the use of hedging instruments by the SIV, something we have not really talked about, principally intended to eliminate currency or interest rate gaps between assets and liabilities in a manner very similar to what we discussed for traditional multisailor vehicles. We can now revise our earlier calculation of SIV economics to reflect more accurately the features we have just described. We assume that the assets and capital structure of the SIV and their related yield and cost are as shown in the table about to appear. Assets 100 as before, yielding LIBOR plus 25. Commercial paper 45 only, roughly half the liabilities, at LIBOR flat as before. Medium-term notes 50 at LIBOR plus 10 as discussed. Backstop liquidity lines 20% of total size for a fee of 10 basis points as discussed. And finally, capital notes 5% of the total, paying LIBOR plus S as before. Once again, we can solve for the spread on the capital note by solving for S in this equation, substantially the same as before, but where we have also added on the right-hand side and adjusted for the principal amounts, reflecting the medium-term notes and, of course, the bank liquidity. This time we see that S equals only 360 basis points. These economics are clearly less attractive than before, since the direct and indirect costs of liquidity have reduced the spread of the capital notes by some 140 basis points from the previous 500 basis points. And we must remember that this spread still needs to be split between the capital note holders and the asset manager or sponsor. This split has been negotiated in many different ways by different parties. We are aware of at least some cases in which the sponsor receives half the spread once the return on the capital notes exceeds LIBOR plus 50. In our preceding example, you should be able to verify quickly that this implies a split of LIBOR plus 205 for the note holders and 155 basis points for the sponsor. We find this split singularly favorable to the sponsor, who is, after all, putting none of his capital at risk, as compared to the capital note purchaser. The question therefore arises whether this return to the capital note holder meets its own hurdle rates from the perspective of return on regulatory capital. You should first remember that Basel II sets capital charges for securitized investments by reference principally to their credit rating, and usually requires first loss tranches, such as the capital notes, to be deducted from capital. These rules are discussed extensively in several of our other modules. The capital notes are certainly in a first loss position, so would need to be deducted from capital unless they are able to obtain a decent credit rating in their own right, generally defined under Basel II to mean BB or higher. Once again, the precise rules are complex and depend on a number of variables, such as the extent of diversification of the pool and whether the bank investing in the capital notes has adopted the standardized or the more sophisticated IRB, as it is called, versions of Basel II. But a reasonable summary is to apply a 100% risk weight to capital notes that are able to earn at least an investment-grade credit rating, such as BBB or BBB+. Whether the capital notes are able to receive this desired investment-grade rating depends, of course, on a number of features, but quite often it has indeed been possible to achieve ratings of BBB and very occasionally single A, particularly where the assets in the SIV are rated comfortably in the AA or AA+ categories. Assuming the bank funding this investment can do so at LIBOR flat, then the spread of 2.05% previously calculated versus the capital requirement of 8% generates for the bank a pre-cost, pre-tax return on capital of just over 25%, which is generally acceptable to those banks that consider themselves reasonably well capitalized already and therefore able to tolerate a lower return on capital than some of their less generously capitalized peers. Of course, this return on capital would be enhanced significantly if a split that was more favorable to the note holders could be negotiated. We conclude this chapter by examining the triggers that require the SIV to begin liquidating its assets. Once again, these triggers differ significantly from case to case, as well as in their consequences. Sometimes the trigger puts the SIV in a sort of repair mode, in which it need not yet begin the complete liquidation of its portfolio, but must simply undertake a few necessary steps to return to its previous health. In other cases, the SIV must cease issuing new debt until the portfolio has returned to its previous health, and so on. One key objective of the triggers when circumstances have become somewhat desperate is to force the liquidation of the portfolio fast enough to assure the repayment of all debt, i.e. the CP and MTNs, before the complete erosion of the capital notes. For this purpose, many SIVs set this trigger at the point at which the mark-to-market loss on the portfolio has become large enough to erode 50% of the initial value of the capital notes. The table you're about to see illustrates the mechanism for this kind of trigger, assuming credit spreads on AA securities in the SIV are widening significantly. For example, we can assume that the AA spread across the board widens by 60 basis points. Remembering that our assets are all assumed to be 3-year floating rate securities, we identify or attach to those assets a spread duration that can be calculated to be about 2.5. This concept of spread duration is similar to a bond's concept of duration, which gives a relationship between, in the case of a regular bond, yield movements and the percentage price movement corresponding to it. Since these are floating rate securities, movements in the absolute level of interest rate can be shown to be relatively of minor consequence, but movements in the spread over LIBOR of the security have an unquestioned impact on the price of the security. That relationship here is assumed to be and can be proven to be roughly 2.5, which means that a 1 basis point widening would trigger a 2.5 basis point price fall in the value of the security. Some of our other modules, in particular modules discussing floating rate securities and the related concept of asset swaps, would discuss spread duration in more detail. Continuing with the table, the multiplication of the two numbers above enables us to calculate that the price effect resulting from this assumed 60 basis point spread widening would be 150 basis points. Since this is affecting all securities in the portfolio as a whole would be suffering a mark-to-market loss equal to 1.5%. And since the capital notes represent 5% of the total assets, dividing the 1.5% by the 5% reaches the conclusion that the erosion of the capital notes fair value or book value would be around 30% of the initial amount. Therefore, under this scenario, which is already relatively extreme, no liquidation event would have been triggered, since we have not reached a point of 50% erosion for the capital notes. It will be noted that until very recent times, a scenario involving a systematic 60 basis point widening across AA rated 3-year securities would have been considered extreme, to say the least. It will be noted further that to reach a 50% erosion level on the capital notes, at which liquidation is usually triggered, the spread widening of the assets would have had to reach a full 100 basis points under our previous assumptions. An even more extreme scenario. And finally, it will be noted that to wipe out the capital notes completely, the AA spread needs to widen by almost 200 basis points. A scenario that would have been considered unthinkable until very recent times, particularly since the SIV would already be actively rushing to sell its portfolio at that point, hopefully before spreads have had time to widen much further. All these observations go a long way towards understanding why, from a solvency perspective, the rating agencies felt comfortable that the credit rating of the MTN's NCP could easily fall in the highest categories, which in turn, of course, justified the low yields paid on them to their investors.